many discussions. I'd like to just start by thanking the staff in the governor's office. There, many of whom are in the room with us today. They have worked with diligence and professionalism and commitment for the people of Minnesota, and I express my gratitude to each and every one of them for the work they've done this year and for the many months that have preceded it. I'll comment specifically about this session in just a moment, but before I do, I'll make a few background comments. People often talk about life being like a river. I think that's true. And as we think about that analogy, you have to decide how you want to navigate a river. And every once in a while, as you travel down a river, you reach a fork in the river, and you have to decide which way to go. And Minnesota reached that point when I was elected in 2002, and we had a fork in the river about which direction to take. One route was a route of higher taxes, more government spending, and more government as usual in Minnesota. We chose a different path, the path of reducing taxes, the path of shrinking government spending, and imposing real reform in Minnesota. Minnesota needed this kind of change. When I came to office in 2003, iTunes did not yet exist. And now today they recently downloaded or had downloaded their 10 billionth song on iTunes. Facebook didn't yet exist in 2003, and now they have over 400 million users. In 2003, when I was elected, the state faced a historic recession. We began to see some recovery some years after that, and then the nation plunged back into the worst recession since World War II. And when we first started in this office, a few of my senior staff had Blackberries, and they thought they were interesting devices, but they hadn't yet caught on, and now, of course, people are obsessed with them and use them regularly and intensely. One of Minnesota's challenges, as you've heard me say before, is we have to face the fact that Minnesota can be complacent. I think that's because of its past successes. In other words, Minnesota's past successes have led to a mindset that the state doesn't need to change, and it does. The world is changing very rapidly, demographically, technologically, culturally, economically, politically, and so we were proud to put a marker in the ground and say, from here forward, we need to chart a different path, navigate a different path on the river. Amongst the things that we did is cut spending for the first time in real terms in the 150-year history of the state of Minnesota. The state spent, as many of you have heard me say, from 1960 until I became governor, increases in spending 21% every 2 years. We now have that down to, on average, over my time as governor, about 2% per year. There's been a 30-year goal or so by every governor to get Minnesota at least out of the top 10 in taxes. None of them ever did. We did. We recently got Minnesota out of the top 10 in taxes. We addressed the significant importance of health care reform, but by using free market principles. We also had nation-leading education reforms, including things like getting new school standards, getting rid of the old profile of learning, and getting more rigorous, robust school standards, and being the first state in the nation to have a statewide pay-for-performance plan for teachers. And the QComp plan and the many other elements of that is now what's the flagship direction for the nation as it charts its course in education reform, and much more. And those principles have charted our behavior and our approach to the legislature and the legislation that we have sought and signed into law. And that was the case again this year with the budget bill that was recently negotiated and now voted into law and is coming to my desk. Some of the highlights of that bill from our perspective are these. We solved a historic $3 billion budget deficit without raising taxes. That is so important now more than ever to make sure that Minnesota is a place where our tax burdens do not get worse, where we send the signal to job providers and entrepreneurs who are willing to add employees and take risks and provide jobs for our fellow citizens that this is a place that they want to be and that we don't overburden them with tax increases. We also reduced spending in this bill, which is so very important. In the biennium that we're in right now, that spending reduction compared to the previous biennium will be almost a 10% reduction. I think it's a 9.3 or 4% reduction. We also removed from the budget bill surcharges and fees that were initially demanded and continually demanded by the DFL. That will help us keep a lid on the rising costs of healthcare costs at a time when we need to be reducing healthcare costs, not increasing them. And then the issue of whether the service that we provide and the help that we provide to low-income Minnesotans who need help with their health care of whether that's going to continue to be provided on a state-based program or whether the state might pursue those kinds of programs at the federal level will be decided by me between now and when my term ends as governor, and then it will be decided by the next governor when he or she is elected in next January. And so I'm very grateful that we were able to stop the effort to put Minnesota into that program and allow the governor to decide that issue on behalf of the state of Minnesota. The unallotments were enacted in this bill for the most part, and so we're grateful that they were put into the bill and signed into law. I know the lawsuit was about some other things, but it's a little ironic that we had all that litigation only to get to the point where the DFL decided they agreed with the unallotments. Then we also have the no contingent use of the FMAP money. So if the FMAP money does or doesn't come in, it won't affect the main framework of this budget, but if it does come in, it will be a nice windfall that will go to the bottom line and help our positive balance at the end of this biennium. There were other accomplishments during the session. I won't go through them all, but Brian McClung will put a more detailed accomplishment sheet up on our website later today or early this afternoon, which will go through other highlights from the session from our perspective. But just to hit a few of them, I'm very pleased that the Ignition Interlock DWI legislation passed. I think that will give Minnesota a significant step forward and another significant tool in combating the problem of drunk driving in our state and forcing people to either, if you don't breathe, you can't leave, as an approach from the state of Minnesota, I think will be helpful in those efforts, and we're proud that that initiative was well received by the legislature and now will be passed into law. We're also very proud and grateful that the language was added this year to allow the Vermilion State Park acquisition to go forward. As you'll remember, that was one of our premier initiatives in recent years to get that park funded and authorized, but existing law did not allow us to consummate the deal because of restrictions on how we could purchase the land and the amount we could purchase it for, and that got changed this session. And by the way, we did sign that agreement recently with U.S. Steel, so that transaction is now completed. We vetoed nearly $500 million in tax increases that were ill-advised and took Minnesota down the old path on the river in the wrong direction on the river, and I'm glad that those taxes were vetoed, and I was proud to do that. We laid the groundwork for a revitalized Ford plant in St. Paul. We reformed health care in a number of ways, but most importantly, after I line item vetoed the GAMC bill last year, we were able to recreate a new GAMC program that was built on a new concept for health care in the country. It will be nation leading in concept, and that is moving people from paying for their health care based on just volumes of procedures to having providers be more accountable for outcomes and to managing better health care outcomes and getting paid for that, and accountable care organizations. I think you'll hear more and more about those kinds of approaches in the coming years in Minnesota and across the country, and that will be a early entrant in the area of reform of accountable care organizations. We were able to have a bonding bill, which was the size that we recommended and directed the legislature to have at a little less than $700 million, so that's affordable. That's what was allowed for in the forecast, in other words, in our budget, and we're able to bring the bonding bill in at that number. And of course, along the way, there were some disappointments, and again, I won't go through them all, but a few that come to mind were the failure of the legislature to address and pass meaningful education reforms. We had an opportunity to participate in a second phase of Race to the Top, but the legislature was unable or unwilling to pass any meaningful education reforms that would have better positioned Minnesota for that competition and improve the opportunities for students in our state. That was extremely disappointing. The bill that was passed leaves a significant projected deficit in not the current budget cycle, but the upcoming budget cycle. From the time we announced our budget in February and throughout this process, including up to the final minutes of the negotiation, we continue to ask and request and push the DFL to pass permanent spending reductions that would have dramatically reduced that tails number. They refused to do that. That was disappointing. And then, of course, the unallotment decision was disappointing, but as I said, it's a little ironic the DFL had to go through all of that trouble only to find out they agreed with me in this legislation, but I understand from their perspective there are other principles in mind. So all in all, even though the process was challenging, the outcome from my perspective is a very good one. I'll be happy to take your questions. Brian, can I get a water or a pop?
Governor, can you explain how you fix the budget deficit over the long term, considering 2 2/3 of it is school payment delay and unallotments aren't permanent?
Yeah, well, each two-year cycle, the governor has an obligation, the legislature has an obligation to balance the budget. And so we have done that every biennium that I've been governor, and it will be done every biennium in the future. So these are projections, and they're contingent upon either future economic projections or future decisions by the legislature. But for example, there's a number of things you can do to pretty easily knock down that so-called tail number. That tail number has this full $1.9 billion school shift paid back all in the next biennium. You could do that in installments or increments. You could make the unallotments permanent. We have lived with the unallotments for over a year, and the state has easily adjusted to them, and the state has performed very well under those circumstances. So you can add $830 million instantly by just continuing the unallotments, and then that number continues to multiply in the coming years. Once the federal maintenance of efforts requirements are lifted after this budget cycle, you'll have all sorts of new options for spending reductions that you don't have now, because the federal government has a floor on the cuts that we can make through the maintenance of effort opportunities. And so you can pretty rapidly knock down that tail number if you're willing to make some difficult decisions, tough decisions. And we have done that over the years. We've done all of that. Every budget cycle that I've been here, we've had a balanced budget, and they will in the future as well.
Governor, as you leave this final negotiation, what do you think your impact has been on the tone, just the state of things here?
Well, Minnesota needed to change. Excuse me. It's a very liberal state. It's one of the most liberal states in the country, has been for a long time. Was on an absolute spending binge, 21% increases from 1960 to 2002, unsustainable, reckless government that was far exceeding any reasonable future expectation to pay for it. And we charted a different and better course, a more realistic course, a more contemporary course for the state of Minnesota. So we have begun the process of changing the direction of this state. We have substantially restructured the state. We have dramatically changed the financial trajectory and performance of the state in a way that will if it continues, will allow Minnesota to prosper and have a brighter future.
What about the tone between the parties, would you say?
Well, it depends on, at times we have, cooperated on all kinds of things. When we did QComp some years ago, we had great cooperation. When we had the DWI legislation, we had great bipartisan cooperation and votes. But make no mistake, we fought hard about the major differences about the values and principles that I believe, and the other side believes strongly from their standpoint. But when it comes to whether we should or shouldn't raise taxes in this state, we fought hard. When it comes to whether we're going to listen to just the teacher unions from the DFLs, as they tend to do, or whether we're going to have real education reform, we fought hard. But so it hasn't always been a cakewalk. It hasn't always been smooth. But the principles that I have laid down, I believe, are absolutely right for the future direction of this state, will serve the state well. And as I think you'll see, and I'll predict to you today, you'll see this unfold in very dramatic fashion at the federal, state, and local level all across the country in the next 5 or 7 years. So what we're doing now in Minnesota, in shrinking government spending, putting a lid on taxes, reducing taxes in Minnesota, restructuring government, is going to unfold by necessity in a very dramatic fashion across the country and in governments up and down the chain in the next 5 to 10 years. So I think we're actually ahead of our time and got a good running start on it.
Governor, does this bill solve the capital problem?
Well, what it does do, Bill, is we'll get you a spreadsheet when it's available and people get some sleep, but there's some really interesting things that happened in this bill that are going to help a lot. So we solved the deficit without using the FMAP money, and if the FMAP money actually comes in, that's over $400 million that just falls to the bottom line. Even though that FMAP money may be authorized this year in Congress, it isn't deployed in Minnesota, arrive in Minnesota till January. So it'll be here during this biennium, but it won't be available during what will be the most acute challenge in cash flow this late summer and fall. But it'll show up in January, so that'll help. There was also some additional cuts made in the bill in the Health and Human Service area beyond the unallotments that will also fall to the bottom line. That's I think they total over $100 million. In addition, we didn't use much of the cash flow account, which we thought we might have to use some or all of it, so the remainder of that is available and essentially falls to the bottom line. So when the biennium ends, assuming no other economic change or change in projections, which they will change, but if you had to take a snapshot of it today, based on today's information, we'll end the biennium with a substantial positive balance. That's good. But the interim challenge will be to navigate through the fall and early winter when the episodic nature of how we take in money and send out money will be most challenging. But I think we can do that.
On the FMAP money is not built into your budget solution that you've said it would fall to the bottom line. Are there any asterisks attached to that? I mean, I assume there are some conditions on what that money's spent on.
It's reimbursing the state at a higher percentage for something we do anyhow, but it isn't earmarked. The net effect of it is it's available for general use.
Governor, as a matter of process, I'm curious, have you in the last few days, or do you plan to in coming days, actually you formally tell Alice Seegren do not apply for Race to the Top, or will you leave that decision to her? Or?
Well, no, I will make that decision after being briefed by and consulting with the commissioner. But based on the legislature's absolute failure, and I mean absolute failure, to meaningfully address education reforms that are a growing matter of consensus in the nation, it is highly unlikely that we'll proceed with that application. It is one of the most disappointing displays of willingness or ability to take on something that is so obvious, so much a matter of consensus, that it can only be explained by power politics by certain interest groups.
Is that a failure of yours not to be able to bring the legislature on board, not to be able to persuade them, not to be able to move them to something so that some of those things can happen in education?
Well, I think we'll just be very blunt about it, Rachel. There's one group that controls those decisions. They have disproportionate influence over one caucus in the legislature, and if you want to get to the heart of the matter, there it is.
Governor, Senator Bach says he will shortly begin to work on a couple of different tax proposals that he wants to present next session to try to make the tax structure a little less volatile. What kind of advice would you give to him going in?
Well, Senator Bach over the years has had all kinds of proposals for various things. I enjoy talking to Senator Bach, so I don't know what he has in mind, so it's hard for me to respond to him. So I guess I'd have to wait to see what his proposals are.
What components would you like to see?
Yeah, my view is Minnesota's clearly has to reduce tax rates and be more competitive nationally. You cannot be a fair-minded person who comprehensively, in a fair way, looks at the tax data, set aside the political rhetoric, just looks at tax rates and other related data, and conclude that Minnesota is an under-taxed state. So my advice to Senator Bach is to focus on reducing business tax rates. We have amongst the highest business tax rates in the world. Get those down into a more competitive range. We should also make sure that income tax rates are reduced in Minnesota. They are too high. We should have a capital gains exemption or some sort of preferential treatment for capital gains. We don't in Minnesota, and we're losing investment and people to states that do. I just talked to another business person the other day at the fishing opener who is leaving Minnesota because of that issue and other tax-related issues. So we need to make Minnesota more competitive by lowering tax burdens in the state.
By the way, that chiming in, that wasn't my deal.
I thought it was an NPR reporter. Well, it was a close call, and I studied the bill carefully. But when you look at the bill in terms of its net impacts, you see, and if I'm off a little bit, but basically it's going to reduce the projected increases in benefits by $2 billion over the next 5 years. The bulk of that is going to come out of reduced benefits or reductions in projected benefits, as well as employee contributions. And those funds are in trouble. You're going to also see, by the way, over the next 5 and 10 years, all across the country, pension reform, these things are going to happen, not just pension reform, but the restructuring of government, not because of some political rhetoric, because it's becoming a matter of junior high mathematics. The conclusion about where this is all headed is inescapable. It is mathematically determinable, and there is going to be a massive restructuring, I think, of these kinds of programs, entitlement programs, pensions, government spending overall, because you have spending graphs that look like this and revenue graphs that look like that, and the two lines don't catch up. So this is a great case study for what's coming. In my view, the bill was a helpful Band-Aid, but what really needs to be done is you have to begin to fundamentally change pensions, public employee pensions, keep the commitments to the people who are currently there, because we made them, and if they're moving towards retirement, we're not going to pull the rug out from underneath them. But for anybody new who is hired, they have to have a different benefit set. It has to be a defined contribution, not a defined benefit. The whole rest of the world is moved in that direction. We have very few people anymore who have those kinds of fixed, ever-increasing, always-increasing pensions, regardless of what the economy's doing, regardless of what the stock market's doing. It is disassociated with the reality of the modern world, and it's going to have to change.
Governor, the Democrats, Senator Pawlenty specifically, I'll wait till you finish that.
It's okay, Bill. Go ahead.
Senator Pawlenty specifically says that the out years, as far as the budget deficit is concerned, that under the plan you've been advocating that has really been implemented here, basically, you're kicking the can down the road further than would have been kicked down the road under Democrats.
Yeah, but I want to just make sure you have the facts here, Bill, because the rhetoric is always that, and I will challenge you to make sure you have the facts as you report this. When we presented our budget in February, and as amended, our so-called out biennium projected deficit was in the neighborhood of $2.6 billion. $2.6 billion. And again, with not many moves, you could get close to eliminating that, in my view, fairly easily. So we hear this rhetoric from the DFL about tails, the out-year deficit. They don't have a plan. They don't have a plan all session. They don't have a plan. They refuse to reveal what they're going to do. They think they have a better way. They're using all this rhetoric. Finally, in the dark of night, as we predicted with Pat Kessler, he's not here, but he asked me this over the Department of Revenue. Dark of night, out comes their plan. They say they're going to be about transparency. They announce it, hear it and pass it, within, 12 hours. And you look at that tax bill that I vetoed, which is their plan, $500 million in tax increases and all the other stuff. The tail number, $4.6 billion, almost twice as big as the one that we had. Then they passed their budget bill the other night. Remember that? The one I was going to veto, although they pulled it back. That was their budget bill. $5.6 billion tail. So anytime Senator Poggemiller or any of them open their mouth 1 inch about the out-year deficit, go look at their plan, not by rhetoric, but I can get you the spreadsheets in their tax bill, on their budget bill, and on their proposals here. Every one of them was double or more than the proposals we had all session. And until the very last minute of the negotiations, we repeatedly pushed them on permanent spending cuts or other changes to bring that number down. They refused and said no to every one of them every time.
Dr. Pawlenty, could you describe please how the GAMC bill was altered last night? Was $10 million added to the fund?
Yes, there is a uncompensated care pool in the new GAMC framework that was funded at $20 million under the existing law. $10 million was added to that to supplement the money that will be available for that uncompensated care pool. That's one aspect of the GAMC bill. Then there were some other technical changes made as well to make it clear that the kinds of cap relief or cap availability that the large hospitals signed up for would also be available to hospitals statewide. And then there were a couple other date changes and a few other mechanical changes, but that's the essence of it.
Do you think that state government can be cut by 20% and state employees 20%?
Yes. can't do it with the current maintenance of effort requirement. We've done it 10%. I mean, like I said, the state spending from last biennium to this one is 10%. And if you do that for a few bienniums in a row, and you get there.
Did you propose 20% cut? And if so, why not?
We proposed and received a 10% cut in one biennium. These kinds of changes will have to happen over time. You're not going to be able to do it all in one fell swoop. But if you have, say, 4 or 8 years more, I think you can get there.
Can you do 20% without cutting K-12 education?
It depends on what kind of reform and restructuring you're willing to do, Bill. I mean, a lot of this is presupposed by the kinds of restructuring that has to take place. And believe me, it needs, and it will take place. Again, this is no longer going to be a matter of right versus left or conservative versus liberal or Republican versus Democrat. It is going to be a matter of junior high mathematics. You cannot take the platform that Minnesota was on and continue it going forward. It has to be reformed, changed, restructured, streamlined, reduced. We have done that, as evidenced by what I've just said here today. But that effort is going to need to continue.
What are your plans what do you have to accomplish? Will you be doing a lot of time?
Well, I'm going to diligently read your blog so you can breathlessly, you and Sheck can breathlessly and obsessively report on every trip I take, every plane ride I'm on, and all of that. It's really riveting. I mean, I'm so drawn to it.
You know about your travel plans, but not everyone knows about them. We try to help.
Excellent. We appreciate that public service. Well, we'll do some. I've got a number of things I'm working on, so we'll do some fishing this summer.
Any advice for the Vikings, Governor? You won't be around, but they'll be back.
Well, I think that issue understandably got sidelined by the unallotment decision, Eric, and the resulting fallout from that. And again, the Vikings are a very important asset to Minnesota. We cannot and should not lose the Vikings, but the details of how you put that together are important. And as I said, at least for me, I wasn't going to raise state taxes to spend on that. But if somebody had a creative idea, we would consider it. One thing, though, as you sequence that discussion, one piece of advice I'd give to Senator Bach, who was also the Vikings stadium champion and various other things he grabs onto, you have to have a local partner. So for the Vikings or anyone else to say we have these ideas that just float around, I mean, it starts with, do you have one or more local entities who are willing to serve as the host for the facility and to share in the financing of it? That's not the only thing. And to this day, they still don't have a local partner identified. They don't have a relationship in that regard firmed up. And that makes the rest of it difficult because you don't have the basic building block in place of how the rest of it might be put together.
Last question here.
Under some circumstance, if all of those pieces were to come together and there was an urgency factor on the part of the Vikings, would you consider calling a special session?
Oh, I think the Vikings issue is going to have to wait now till next year, Bill. And again, they're not going to stay in the Metrodome. They've made it clear they're not going to stay in the Metrodome. The issue is going to have to be brought to a head and resolved, but it is an issue that will be dealt with in the next legislative session.
Along the same line, could you see some circumstances under which you might have to call the legislature back in a special session for budgetary relief for the remaining priorities?
It doesn't look like that. Well, these economic circumstances are volatile. So, you have the situation in Greece. You have open talk about the possibility of the euro unwinding, people leaving the euro as a currency. You have destabilized financial markets in Portugal and Spain and Italy and Ireland. You have the possibility of bubbles in significant other foreign markets, potentially including China. You have some economists predicting a double dip in the United States, others predicting a slow climb out. We can't say, nor can anyone say, what the situation is going to look like a year from now. We don't know. But based on what we know today, there wouldn't be any need on the financial side for a special session. Well, the Supreme Court case says that unallotment is available after you have a balanced budget.
And do we now have a balanced budget?
Yes.
Governor, just
Thanks, guys.
when you'll sign the bill, approximately?
We haven't received it yet, so after we receive it.
We usually don't sign it until we get it.
Well, I understand that.